Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're not talking about knights polishing their armor or maidens waiting in castles. No, tonight we're stepping into the shadows of the Middle Ages. The world of outlaws, rebels, pirates, and rulers who went too far. These weren't just names scrawled on parchment. They were the nightmares of kings, the whispers around tavern fires, the faces peasants either feared or secretly admired. Some of them were real monsters. Some of them were heroes dressed up as criminals. And all of them were unforgettable. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe if you love history told raw and alive. Drop me a comment and let me know what country you're watching from. It always amazes me to see people from every corner of the world gathering here. Now, let's dive straight into the medieval underworld. Picture this. It's the year 1450. Europe is a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and endless battlefields. There's no FBI list, no Interpol, no posters in every tavern. Most wanted back then meant the king's decree, a bounty whispered into the ear of mercenaries, or a local lord promising gold if you brought in someone's head. And depending on where you stood, that wanted man could be a villain or the only person standing up for you. That's the beauty and the terror of medieval history. Truth was always written by whoever had the sword in hand. Let's start with one of the darkest legends, Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Forget the Hollywood vampire for a second. The real man didn't drink blood, but he sure spilled enough of it. Born in Transylvania in 1431, he grew up hostage to the Ottomans, learning early that mercy was a luxury no ruler could afford. When he finally took his throne, he ruled with terror as his weapon. His signature punishment was impalement, forcing a stake through the body and planting it upright for the world to see. And he didn't do this in secret. No, Vlad made forests of corpses along the roads, a grotesque warning billboard. This is what happens if you cross me. Imagine being an Ottoman soldier, marching into his lands, and suddenly stumbling upon 20,000 bodies swaying in the wind. That's exactly what Sultan Mehmed II faced. His massive army turned back, terrified by the message. In a twisted way, Vlad had weaponized horror itself. But what happens when your entire rule is built on fear? Eventually, your enemies gather, your own nobles betray you, and the same terror you spread comes crashing back. Vlad was captured, killed, and his head delivered to the Sultan. Yet centuries later, his legend gave birth to Dracula, proving that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who were real. If Vlad was horror, Eustace the monk was chaos. Born around 1170 inches northern France, he actually started as a Benedictine monk. Some say he studied black magic. Others claim he was just good at playing people's fears. But monastery life wasn't enough for him. He walked out, picked up a sword, and became a pirate. And not just any pirate, the kind of man who could terrify both England and France at the same time. One year he'd fight for the English king, the next he'd switch sides and fight for the French, and sometimes he just fought for himself. He took over the Channel Islands and ran them like his personal pirate kingdom. Merchants dreaded his sails, kings cursed his name, and common folk whispered stories of his tricks. Imagine the whiplash of seeing a monk's robe traded for a blood-stained cutlass. His end came at the Battle of Sandwich in 1217, when he was captured and beheaded without ceremony. Both England and France were relieved. proving just how dangerous one man could be when he refused to play by anyone's rules but his own. From chaos, we move to genius. Jan Žižka of Bohemia might be the most unlikely general in history. Born around 1360, he lost one eye as a child, and later the other, completely blind. And yet, he became a commander who never lost a battle. How? By reinventing the art of war. Žižka created war wagons, heavily armed carts, chained together into moving fortresses. Farmers with crossbows and early guns could fend off elite knights like they were swatting flies. With this, he turned peasants into an unstoppable army. Even blind, he directed troops with memory, messengers, and instinct. His enemies feared him so much that some refused to fight if his name was mentioned. And when he died, rumors spread that he ordered his skin to be made into a drum so he could keep terrifying foes from beyond the grave. Whether true or not, the story itself shows just how much of a legend he became. Then, there's Owain Glyndwr, the rebel Prince of Wales. Born into wealth, he could have lived comfortably under English rule. Instead, in 1400, he declared himself Prince of Wales and led a rebellion that shook England to its core. For over a decade, he ambushed troops, struck castles, and disappeared into the hills. Villagers swore he could vanish into mist, that he had supernatural powers. In truth, he just knew Wales better than his enemies. The rebellion eventually fizzled out, but Glyndwr himself was never captured. He simply vanished. To the English, it was a failure of justice. To the Welsh, it was hope, a ghost prince who might one day return. Legends like that never die, and centuries later, he's still celebrated as a national hero. Not all most wanted figures were rebels. Some were aristocrats who crossed the line into nightmare. Enter Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess. Born in 1560, she had power, wealth, and castles sprawling across Hungary. But rumors swirled that behind those castle walls, she tortured and killed hundreds of girls, bathing in their blood to preserve her youth. Whether those tales were truth or political conspiracy, they stuck hard. When investigators came in 1610, they claimed to find evidence of unspeakable crimes. Elizabeth was walled up in her own castle, sealed in until her death 4 years later. Was she a monster or a victim of a smear campaign by powerful men who envied her land? History can't answer with certainty, but her legend, like Vlad's, has outlived the truth. Her story parallels Gilles de Rais, once a celebrated French noble and comrade of Joan of Arc. After her death, his name turned sour. Accused of horrific crimes, kidnapping, torture, murder of children, his fall from grace was dizzying. He went from national hero to executed criminal in 1440. Whether guilty or framed, his legacy shows how quickly medieval reputations could flip from glory to horror almost overnight. But not all medieval criminals were nobles, pirates, or generals. Sometimes, the most wanted man was just a poor farmer with a bow. In the Middle Ages, hunting was the king's privilege. Poach a deer, and you risked your life. Imagine a starving family cooking rabbit stew while soldiers dragged their father to the gallows. To peasants, these poachers weren't criminals, they were heroes of survival. Out of that struggle, legends like Robin Hood were born. Most real poachers didn't get songs or ballads, they got punishment. But their defiance proved that when laws are written against survival, everyone is one meal away from becoming most wanted. So here's the question. Who was truly guilty? The pirate who robbed the rich? The noble who killed for sport? The rebel prince who refused foreign rule? Or the peasant who snared a rabbit? In the medieval world, wanted often just meant you stood on the wrong side of power. And that's only the beginning. We've met Dracula's shadow, the pirate monk, the blind general, the ghost prince, the blood countess, the fallen knight, and the nameless poachers who risked everything for a meal. Each of them left their mark, shaping not just their time, but the stories we tell centuries later. But, trust me, this gallery of rogues, rebels, and legends is far from finished. In Part 2, we'll meet assassins who changed kingdoms, heretics who burned for their beliefs, and mercenaries who made whole cities tremble. The Middle Ages were a stage, and its most wanted were both actors and executioners in a drama that still echoes today. When we left off, we'd already walked through haunted forests with Vlad the Impaler, sailed stormy seas with a pirate monk, and disappeared into the hills of Wales with Owain Glyndŵr. But the medieval underworld is bigger, darker, and far more fascinating than just a handful of names. If you thought kings and nobles were untouchable, think again. Behind every throne was a shadow, and sometimes that shadow had a knife. Let's talk about assassins, not the video game kind leaping off towers, but the real sect that terrified medieval rulers from the Middle East to Europe. They were called the Hashashin, an order based in the mountains of Persia and Syria. Their leader, Hassan-i-Sabah, turned a fortress at Alamut into both a training ground and a sanctuary. The Hashashin weren't armies. They didn't need numbers. Instead, they specialized in precision killings. Their targets were kings, generals, governors people thought to be untouchable. Imagine being a medieval ruler, surrounded by guards, yet still knowing that one morning you might find a dagger stuck into the pillow beside your bed. That was their calling card. They didn't always kill immediately. Sometimes they left a warning, just to remind their enemies that no wall was too high, no lock too strong. Crusaders feared them, sultans tried to wipe them out, and legends grew that they used secret rituals or drugs to control their men. Truth or exaggeration? The result was the same. Their very name gave us the modern word, assassin. But not all most wanted figures struck from the shadows. Some came at you with an army. Take Bertrand du Guesclin, a French mercenary captain during the 100 Years' War. To the French, he was a hero who bled England's armies dry. To the English, he was a ghost who had to be hunted down at any cost. Du Guesclin was short, stocky, not much to look at, but on the battlefield, he was a genius of ambush and surprise. He didn't fight wars like noble knights, charging in shiny armor. He fought dirty. Guerrilla raids, night attacks, fake retreats. He turned medieval war into chess, and his enemies hated him for it. Captured multiple times, ransomed like a prize stallion, Bertrand just kept coming back. For kings, he was an asset. For the men facing him, he was a nightmare you couldn't kill. And then there were those who weren't soldiers or nobles at all. Those branded criminals simply for their beliefs. In a world where church and crown were fused, heresy was not just dangerous, it was treason. To doubt the church's teachings was to doubt the whole order of society. That's why men like Jan Hus, a Czech preacher in the early 1400s, became some of the most wanted figures of their age. Huss stood in the pulpit and told ordinary people that they didn't need priests as intermediaries to reach God. He denounced corruption, sold indulgences, and the hypocrisy of the wealthy church. His words spread like wildfire because they made sense to peasants who were tired of paying coin for salvation. But for the church, Huss was a fire that needed stamping out. He was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1415 under promise of safe conduct. Instead, he was arrested, tried, and burned at the stake. His ashes were cast into the Rhine, but his ideas lived on, fueling the Hussite wars that shook all of Europe. The lesson was clear. Sometimes, being most wanted just meant you spoke too much truth. If Huss was a preacher turned martyr, William Wallace was a farmer turned rebel. Forget the bagpipes and blue face paint of Hollywood for a second. The real Wallace wasn't a freedom fighter, shining armor. He was a man whose rage exploded after English soldiers murdered his family. Picking up sword and axe, Wallace led raids across Scotland, striking fear into English garrisons. His greatest victory came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where a smaller Scottish force destroyed a much larger English army by bottlenecking them on a narrow bridge. For one shining moment, he was the scourge of England. But rebellion is a hard fire to keep burning. Betrayed, captured, and dragged to London, Wallace suffered a brutal execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head stuck on London Bridge as a warning, yet to this day, he is remembered as a hero. The English called him outlaw. The Scots called him guardian. History, as always, depends on where you're standing. Not all most wanted figures carried swords. Some carried words. Consider Peter Abelard, a brilliant scholar in 12th century France. He challenged traditional theology, dared to argue with powerful clerics, and fell in love with his student Heloise in a romance that scandalized the church. For his intellectual boldness and forbidden passion, he was attacked, mutilated by rivals, and hounded by accusations of heresy. In an age when books could be burned and scholars branded dangerous, Abelard shows us that wanted didn't always mean hunted in forests. It could mean silenced in lecture halls. But let's return to the raw brutality of medieval crime. Few figures embody it like Hereward the Wake, an English outlaw of the 11th century. When William the Conqueror took England in 1066, he expected submission. Instead, he found Hereward leading guerrilla resistance in the marshes of Ely. To Norman lords, Hereward was a bandit and traitor. To locals, he was a hero striking back at foreign invaders. Legends say he burned castles, ambushed knights, and slipped away through the fens like a ghost. William branded him most wanted, but Hereward became a symbol of English defiance, a figure that blurred the line between outlaw and patriot. We also can't ignore the darker side of church power. Roger de Mortimer, lover of Queen Isabella of France, might have been one of the most scandalous fugitives of the 14th century. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, he escaped, fled to France, and returned at Isabella's side to overthrow her husband, King Edward II. Imagine the scandal: a queen and her lover seizing the throne. For 4 years, Mortimer ruled England in the king's name, showering himself with wealth and titles. But arrogance is fatal. Edward's son, the future Edward III, seized power at 17 and had Mortimer dragged to the gallows. In his rise and fall, you can see the razor's edge of medieval ambition, one moment ruling, the next dangling from a rope. And then there's piracy, because the seas of the Middle Ages were no less lawless than the roads. We've met Eustace the monk, but he wasn't alone. Pirates infested the Mediterranean and the English Channel. Men like Klaus Störtebeker, a German privateer who became a legend. Captured by the Hanseatic League, he was executed with dozens of his crew. But folklore says his headless body walked past 11 of his men before collapsing. And those 11 were spared execution. Superstition or not, it shows how even in death, pirates carried an aura of dread. The Middle Ages were obsessed with order, kings on thrones, peasants in fields, priests in pulpits. But the most wanted were the cracks in that order. They were reminders that no system, no matter how strict, could fully contain human ambition, greed, anger, or hope. Whether rebels like Wallace, heretics like Huss, assassins in Persia, or pirates on the North Sea, these figures proved that danger always came from below, from within, or from the shadows. So ask yourself, who really threatened the medieval world more? The bandit in the woods, or the baron who taxed his people until they starved? The heretic with a book, or the bishop with a crown? The pirate at sea, or the king who sent endless armies into pointless wars? In the next part, we'll meet women who defied the rules and paid the price, outlaws, warriors, and visionaries who became most wanted simply for refusing to stay silent. From Joan of Arc to powerful queens accused of treason, their stories remind us that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could be in the Middle Ages was a woman who refused to bow. Let's start with the most famous of them all, Joan of Arc. She wasn't born into power, wasn't trained for battle, and had no title to protect her. She was just a teenage girl from a small French village. And yet, she became one of the most wanted figures of her age. Picture France in the early 1400s, torn apart by the 100 Years' War. English armies had occupied vast swaths of land. The French crown was weakened, fractured, and on the verge of collapse. Into this chaos walked Joan, claiming that God had spoken to her that she was chosen to drive out the English and restore the rightful king. Imagine the audacity. A peasant girl telling hardened generals what to do, and yet she won them over. At 17, Joan led troops into battle, clad in armor, banner raised high. At Orléans, her presence turned despair into victory. Soldiers who had been losing for years suddenly believed again. To the French, she was a savior. To the English, she was a witch, a heretic, a rebel who had to be captured at all costs. And when they finally did, the trial was a farce. They accused her of sorcery, of dressing as a man, of blasphemy. What they couldn't admit was the truth. She had beaten them. Burned at the stake at 19, Joan became both martyr and symbol. Most wanted, yes, but also most unforgettable. Now, not every wanted woman of the Middle Ages carried a sword. Some wielded influence, and that was dangerous enough. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, mother of kings Richard the Lionheart and John. But her independence and ambition made her a threat. Eleanor joined her sons in rebellion against her husband, King Henry II of England. For that, she was imprisoned for years. A queen locked away not for murder, not for treason, but for daring to challenge a king. To rulers of the Middle Ages, a woman with that much power was most wanted, even without breaking a single law. And then there were women accused of crimes darker still. Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, was married to Edward II of England. Their marriage was a political alliance, but Edward's favoritism toward his male companions pushed Isabella aside. Did she accept her role quietly? Not at all. She conspired with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to overthrow her husband. In 1327, Edward was deposed, imprisoned, and if the rumors are true, murdered in captivity under horrific circumstances. Isabella ruled as regent for her young son, but her enemies never forgot. To some, she was a liberator. To others, she was a schemer, a murderer, a queen who turned predator. History branded her dangerous, and rightly or wrongly, she has never shaken the name She-Wolf. Not all women on the wanted list were queens. Some were mystics. Consider Marguerite Porete, a French Beguine writer in the 13th century. She wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical text about the soul's relationship to God. It sounds harmless, even spiritual, but her ideas were so radical, claiming the soul could reach God without church or priest, that the Inquisition saw her as a threat. She was arrested, condemned, and burned at the stake in Paris. Why? Because her words challenged the monopoly of the church. For her, being most wanted meant daring to put thoughts into writing that others only whispered. Then there's Alice Keitler, Ireland's most famous accused witch. In the early 1300s, she was a wealthy woman who had outlived 4 husbands. That alone raised suspicions. Neighbors whispered that she had poisoned them, that she consorted with demons, that she practiced sorcery to amass her fortune. The Bishop of Ossory launched a furious investigation. Keitler fled, escaping execution, but her maid was flogged and burned in her place. For the authorities, Alice wasn't just guilty of witchcraft, she was guilty of being a woman with too much money, too much independence, and too much survival. That was crime enough. The Middle Ages didn't have a most wanted list written down on parchment. But make no mistake, there was always a mental list in the minds of kings, bishops, and nobles. Who threatened their order? Who stirred the people? Who embarrassed them by simply existing outside the rules? For women, the bar was far lower. A man could rebel and still be admired. A woman who stepped out of line could be branded dangerous, heretic, witch, traitor. So, when we talk about the most wanted people of medieval history, we're really talking about cracks in the wall of patriarchy, of monarchy, of church power. Women like Joan, Eleanor, Isabella, Marguerite, and Alice each showed that even in a world built to cage them, sparks of defiance could set whole kingdoms trembling. And here's a question: do you think the rulers of the Middle Ages truly feared these women, or did they fear what these women represented? Because once you admit that a peasant girl can lead an army, or a queen can overthrow a king, or a woman can speak directly to God without a priest, then the whole medieval order looks less solid. In the next part, we'll shift our gaze toward the darker corners of power, the noblemen and kings who became so notorious, so cruel, or so unpredictable that they themselves ended up as most wanted, not hunted by law, but by the whispers of their own courts, by the rebels under their rule, and sometimes by the knives of their closest allies. Last time, we uncovered how women, queens, mystics, even ordinary wives could end up branded as the most dangerous people of the medieval age. But power in the Middle Ages wasn't just threatened from below. Sometimes, the people at the very top, the kings themselves, were the ones everyone whispered about, feared, and, in some cases, secretly wished gone. Take King John of England. Yes, the same one forever immortalized as the villain in Robin Hood tales. John ruled in the early 13th century, and if you ask historians, they'll tell you he checked nearly every box for most wanted. He taxed his nobles into fury, lost vast territories in France, and earned a reputation for cruelty. Chroniclers say he starved political prisoners to death, sometimes entire families. Even the church turned against him. He was excommunicated by the Pope, a punishment that made his rule look illegitimate in the eyes of his people. By 1215, his barons had enough. They forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that clipped royal power and gave the nobility rights he could no longer trample. To the commoners, John was a disaster. To his nobles, he was a tyrant they couldn't wait to rein in. And in the popular imagination, he became the greedy king who was always outwitted by Robin Hood. Now, if John was despised, Richard III became infamous. His story feels almost like Shakespeare wrote it. Oh wait, he did. Richard ruled England briefly in the 1480 seconds and is remembered as one of history's great villains. The reason? The disappearance of his two young nephews, known as the Princes in the Tower. When Richard seized the throne, the boys' legitimate heirs were locked in the Tower of London. They vanished soon after, never seen again. Did Richard order their deaths? No proof survives, but suspicion clings to him like armor rusted to the bone. His hunchback image, immortalized by Shakespeare, turned him into the ultimate tyrant. The irony? In recent years, his skeleton was dug up under a parking lot in Leicester, giving him a strange second act of fame. But in his lifetime, he was the man no one trusted, the king whose very legitimacy was questioned. Most wanted not by law, but by history itself. And then there's Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Yes, the inspiration for Dracula. In the 15th century, he fought to defend his small kingdom against the Ottoman Empire, but his methods were beyond brutal. Impalement, skewering enemies on stakes, was his signature punishment. It terrified invaders, but it also horrified allies. Tales spread of forests of corpses left outside his cities, warnings that no army dared ignore. To the Ottomans, he was a nightmare. To his own people, he was both protector and monster. Imagine being so feared that centuries later, your name inspires a vampire legend. If that doesn't count as most wanted, what does? But cruelty wasn't always bloody. Sometimes it was political manipulation that made a ruler notorious. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, looked like the perfect king, handsome, dignified, commanding. But he orchestrated one of the most infamous betrayals in medieval history. In 1307, he turned on the Knights Templar, once the most powerful military order in Christendom. Under the pretext of heresy, Philip had their leaders arrested, tortured, and executed, all while seizing their immense wealth to fill his royal coffers. The Pope himself became his puppet. To his subjects, Philip looked like a strong king, but to Europe, he became the monarch who destroyed an order of knights for gold. His enemies whispered that his line was cursed, and within a generation, his dynasty crumbled. Justice or karma? You decide. Not every king on the wanted list was a schemer or tyrant. Some were simply reckless. Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, ruled in the late 14th century. He started his reign full of promise, but soon began to suffer violent fits of insanity. In one infamous episode, he attacked his own knights in a frenzy, killing several before being subdued. He sometimes forgot he was king, or believed he was made of glass and could shatter if touched. His madness left France in chaos, with rival factions tearing the kingdom apart. To his enemies, Charles was weak. To his people, he was a tragedy. Most wanted? Maybe not as a criminal, but as a liability. A king they wished they could replace. And then, let's not forget William the Conqueror, the man who invaded England in 1066. To Normans, he was a hero who carved out a kingdom. To the Anglo-Saxons, he was the ultimate villain, the foreign conqueror who seized their lands, burned their villages, and imposed a new order. Rebels like Hereward the Wake rose against him, turning swamps into fortresses and making William's armies slog through mud just to chase ghosts. To the Saxons, William was most wanted in the worst sense. A foreign overlord who could never be forgiven. History remembers him as the conqueror, but for those who lived under his sword, he was something closer to the invader. So what do we see here? Kings and lords who had crowns on their heads, armies at their backs, and yet they were hunted, hated, and remembered as villains. Sometimes their crimes were real, like burning villages or executing rivals. Sometimes it was their failures, like losing wars or falling into madness. And sometimes it was just the stories told after their deaths that sealed their fate. Because here's the truth about being most wanted in the Middle Ages. You didn't need to be hunted by sheriffs or posted on a wall. All it took was fear, resentment, or rumor. Once the people turned against you, once the nobles stopped trusting you, once the church branded you heretic or cursed you were marked. Whether you sat on a throne or hid in a swamp, the weight of being unwanted was the same. And here's a question worth asking. Do you think history judged these rulers fairly? Or are we simply repeating the propaganda of their enemies? Was Richard III truly a murderer? Or just a victim of Shakespeare's pen? Was Vlad a monster? Or a desperate defender against a greater empire? The Middle Ages don't give us easy answers. They give us legends, and legends don't care much for truth. In the next part, we'll leave behind kings and queens and descend into the underworld of medieval society, the assassins, mercenaries, and outlaws who lived in the shadows, always one step away from the gallows. Because sometimes the most wanted weren't crowned in gold, but cloaked in rags, blades hidden in their sleeves. If kings and queens could be feared, imagine those who never wore crowns, but carried daggers in the dark. The Middle Ages had no shortage of assassins, mercenaries, and shadowy figures who lived outside the law, but inside the nightmares of rulers. These were the men who turned survival into a trade, who sold loyalty to the highest bidder, and who became most wanted the moment the deal went sour. One of the most chilling names was Eustace the Monk. Forget the image of monks chanting prayers by candlelight. Eustace wore the habit once, but he turned his back on the monastery to embrace chaos. Born in France around the late 12th century, he studied black magic, or so the stories claimed, and became a pirate feared across the English Channel. His ships terrorized merchants, and his shifting loyalties made him even more dangerous. Sometimes he fought for England, sometimes for France, but always for himself. Chronicles describe him as master of disguise, sneaking into camps dressed as a beggar, a priest, or even a woman. To his enemies, he was a phantom, a trickster whose cunning made him impossible to pin down. Eventually, the English caught him in battle in 1217. They offered him no trial, no mercy. Eustace the monk was beheaded on the deck of his own ship, his head displayed like a warning flag. A holy man turned outlaw. His life shows how thin the line between piety and piracy could be. And then there were the free companies, bands of mercenaries who roamed Europe like wolves, selling their swords when kingdoms went to war. When peace broke out, they became a problem. Unemployed soldiers didn't just go home. They turned their weapons on villages, plundering for survival. The most notorious was the Great Company in 14th century Italy. Thousands strong, they laid siege to towns not for politics but for ransom. Pay them off, and they moved on. Refuse, and your town burned. To rulers, they were both useful and terrifying. Hire them today, and tomorrow they might be raiding your lands. In many chronicles, their leaders are described less like generals and more like warlords, men who treated Europe as their chessboard and civilians as pawns. Closer to the shadows were the assassins for hire, blades bought in back rooms. Forget today's image of secret agents with silenced pistols. In the Middle Ages, an assassin's tools were knives slipped between ribs or poison mixed into wine. Italian city-states were notorious for it. Florence, Venice, Milan, they thrived on trade and politics. And where politics thrived, so did betrayal. Families like the Visconti or the Medici were surrounded by whispers of hired killers lurking at banquets. To be most wanted in these worlds wasn't about having a price on your head alone. It meant living as a rumor, everyone suspecting you, no one daring to accuse you outright. And then we come to the Hashashin, the real assassins whose legend still colors our language today. From their mountain fortresses in Persia and Syria during the Crusades, they targeted kings, generals, and crusader lords. They struck in broad daylight, blending into crowds, then vanishing into smoke and fear. Even the mighty Saladin, one of the most respected leaders of the age, nearly fell to their daggers. Crusaders and Muslims alike feared them because, unlike mercenaries, they couldn't be bought off. They killed for cause, for faith, for the vision of their sect. Europeans whispered that they used hashish to steal their nerves, giving us the word assassin. To medieval minds, they were ghosts who could walk through any defense, a nightmare with human faces. But not every assassin was tied to a sect or an order. Sometimes it was the lone killer, driven by desperation. Chronicles tell of peasants who snapped under oppression and struck down their lords. One story speaks of a villain who, after being whipped and humiliated, ambushed his lord in a forest and killed him with a hatchet. He was executed, of course, but his tale spread, turning him into a folk hero in whispers. For every official most wanted posted by sheriffs, there were dozens of nameless killers who lived and died in the shadows, remembered only in the fear they left behind. And here's the question: were these assassins, villains, or just reflections of their world? In an age where nobles schemed, kings betrayed, and war never truly stopped, Was the dagger in the dark really worse than the sword in open battle? To some peasants, the outlaw who killed a greedy tax collector was a savior. To the rulers, he was a criminal who had to be crushed. To us, centuries later, he's a story that refuses to die. Because that's the strange truth about the medieval most wanted. They weren't always the people with armies, crowns, or castles. Sometimes they were the people with nothing to lose. And in a world as brutal as the Middle Ages, nothing was more dangerous than that. In the next part, we'll look at how ordinary rebels, farmers, villagers, and common folk turned into the faces of resistance. They didn't have daggers or pirate ships. They had hunger, desperation, and a willingness to defy the most powerful men of their age. And sometimes, that was enough to make them the most wanted of all. If mercenaries were wolves and assassins were shadows, then peasants were the storm no one expected. For most of the Middle Ages, the people who plowed fields and paid rents were invisible. They carried kingdoms on their backs, fed armies with their grain, and filled church coffers with their tithes. Yet, when hunger bit too deeply, or when taxes became unbearable, these same peasants rose up, and suddenly the humblest man in the village was on every lord's most wanted list. The English knew this well in 1381, when the peasants' revolt shook the kingdom to its core. Picture the scene. Fields left empty as farmers threw down their tools. Angry mobs marching on London. Banners flying with slogans that mocked the nobility. It started with a simple grievance, an unfair poll tax, but it exploded into something larger. The rebels wanted freedom from serfdom, lower rents, and an end to corrupt officials. At the front of this storm was a man named Wat Tyler, a commoner, nothing more, yet he spoke with the authority of a general. Chroniclers say he moved with fire in his words, drawing thousands to his cause. When he and his army of peasants reached London, it wasn't just a protest. They stormed the Tower, executed royal advisors, and made the boy King Richard II meet them face to face. For one terrifying moment, England trembled. The mighty kingdom stood hostage to a carpenter's voice. Of course, it couldn't last. At a parley, Wat Tyler was cut down, stabbed in the chaos of negotiation. His army scattered soon after, but his death did not erase the fear he inspired. For nobles, Wat Tyler proved that rebellion didn't need knights in shining armor. It only needed hungry men with nothing to lose. That made peasants the most dangerous enemy of all, because there were always more of them. And England wasn't alone. Across Europe, peasant uprisings kept kings awake at night. In France, during the Jacquerie of 1358, villages erupted in violence after endless wars and famine crushed the countryside. Men armed with pitchforks and axes stormed castles, dragged knights from their halls, and burned estates. The rebellion was eventually drowned in blood. The nobles retaliated with brutal massacres, but the memory lingered. Every noble who looked out over his estate knew that beneath the quiet fields lay the potential for fire. Even in Germany, waves of uprisings shook the Holy Roman Empire. The most infamous came in the German Peasants' War of 1524-25, when tens of thousands demanded not just relief from taxes, but freedom in the name of God. Preachers fired up the crowds, declaring that Christ never meant for lords to oppress peasants. Armed with faith as much as weapons, they stormed monasteries and castles. Luther himself, the man whose words inspired Reformation, condemned them when chaos grew too great. The princes united and crushed the revolt, leaving fields soaked in blood. But the sheer scale of the uprising, over 300,000 rebels, proved that the most wanted were no longer outlaws hiding in forests. They were masses demanding justice. And sometimes rebellion wasn't about taxes or freedom. Sometimes it was simply about survival. Imagine a hungry farmer watching deer from the king's forest devour his crops while his children starved. The law forbade him from hunting, yet hunger has no respect for law. He sets a snare, catches a rabbit, and suddenly he's a criminal. If caught, he could lose a hand, an eye, even his life. That man, desperate, armed with nothing but necessity, was as most wanted as any pirate or assassin. It's almost laughable today, the idea that catching a rabbit could mark someone for execution. But in the Middle Ages, this was deadly serious. Kings jealously guarded their hunting rights. Forests were declared royal preserves, and the poorest peasants who dared step into them with a bow risked mutilation. The outlaw poacher became both villain and hero. Ballads sang of men like Robin Hood, who stole not just for himself, but for the people. Whether he existed or not, the myth tells us what mattered. Peasants dreamed of defiance. They longed for someone to stand against the injustice of kings feasting, while children starved. To rulers, rebels, and poachers were criminals. To the people, they were legends. And that tension between power and hunger, privilege and survival, turned the countryside into a powder keg. Every village had its own whispered stories of outlaws hiding in forests, of neighbors who vanished after resisting a tax collector, of men who dared to strike back against their lords. So ask yourself, who was more dangerous in the Middle Ages? The crowned king who commanded armies, or the faceless rebel who could rise from any field, any hut, any starving family? For rulers, the answer was clear. They feared the spark more than the fire, because once a spark lit the countryside, it could consume kingdoms. And that's why the lists of most wanted were not just filled with pirates, assassins, or nobles who betrayed crowns. They were also filled with ordinary men who had the courage or desperation to say no. In the next part, we'll shift our gaze from the peasants' fury to the rulers themselves. Some kings and queens became most wanted, not because they broke laws, but because they defied empires, betrayed allies, or carried reputations too scandalous to ignore. From monarchs who played with fire to nobles who turned into monsters, the stage of history was filled with rulers as hunted as they were feared. When we think of most wanted, our minds usually picture thieves, pirates, or assassins. But sometimes, the most dangerous fugitives wore crowns. In the Middle Ages, kings and queens could rise to glory one year and become outlaws the next. Betray the wrong pope, anger the wrong emperor, lose the wrong battle, and suddenly the ruler of a realm was himself running for his life. Take King John of England, the infamous monarch who signed the Magna Carta in 1215. To us, he looks like the villain of every Robin Hood story. But to his contemporaries, he was far worse. John taxed his nobles into fury, lost Normandy to the French, and managed to alienate nearly everyone who mattered. When he refused to accept the Pope's candidate for Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope Innocent III excommunicated him and placed England under interdict. Imagine every church in your kingdom going silent. No masses, no weddings, no funerals, no last rites. For a deeply religious society, it was as if John had cursed the land. For a moment, the King of England was essentially most wanted by the Catholic Church. His throne dangled by a thread, and even his own barons whispered about rebellion. To save himself, John bent the knee, paying tribute to the Pope and becoming effectively a vassal of Rome. It was humiliation of the highest order. His subjects saw a weak king, and when the barons rose in open revolt, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. He died not long after, despised and hunted in reputation if not in body. History remembered him less as a monarch and more as a cautionary tale. A king so hated that his own nobles turned him into a criminal. And John wasn't alone. In Scotland, another king's crown became a target. Robert the Bruce, today a hero of independence, once murdered his rival in a church. Yes, inside holy ground. That act earned him excommunication and made him an outlaw in the eyes of both crown and church. For a time, Robert was not the Lion of Bannockburn but a fugitive, hunted by English armies, betrayed by nobles, forced into hiding in the wilds. Chroniclers say he even hid in caves, watching a spider spin its web, drawing inspiration from its persistence. Outlaw or not, Robert returned to fight, and eventually won Scotland's freedom. But we must not forget, before he was a king, he was wanted. Sometimes the most wanted weren't kings, but queens whose ambition rattled empires. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. Duchess in her own right, Queen of France, then Queen of England, she was bold, clever, and utterly unwilling to sit quietly. When her sons rebelled against her husband Henry II, Eleanor sided with them. Henry, furious, had her imprisoned. For nearly 16 years, the most dazzling woman of Europe was essentially a prisoner queen, kept under lock and key because she dared to defy her king. Though not a fugitive in the woods, she was certainly wanted, too dangerous to leave free. Yet in time, she returned to power, outliving her husband, guiding her son Richard the Lionheart's reign, and dying a legend. Richard himself had his own wanted moment. During the Third Crusade, he quarreled with his allies, made enemies of local rulers, and on his way home was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria. Imagine it, the Lionheart warrior king of England, taken prisoner like a common brigand. He was held for ransom, and England bled itself dry, raising the silver to buy him back. For that year of captivity, Richard was not the conqueror of Acre, but the most expensive hostage in medieval Europe. And then there were the nobles who crossed lines too far. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, became wanted, not for theft, but for challenging a king. His resistance to Henry II's attempts to control the church led to his murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. Knights loyal to the king struck him down at the altar, turning him into a martyr. Henry II denied ordering it, but the outrage was so great he was forced to do penance, whipped by monks in public. A king scourged like a criminal, because one man dared to stand against him. Across the channel, Joan of Arc tells another version of the story. She began as a peasant girl, rose to lead French armies, and became a symbol of defiance. To the French, she was a saint in the making. To the English, she was the ultimate most wanted. Captured in 1430, she was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and even dressing like a man. The trial was stacked. the verdict preordained. She was burned at the stake, her ashes scattered to prevent any shrine from forming. But her death did not erase her power. If anything, it made her immortal. Joan, the wanted girl of France, outlived every enemy in memory. What ties these figures together is the irony. Crowns and titles should have made them untouchable. Instead, power painted targets on their backs. Some escaped, some were captured, some died in fire or humiliation. But all proved one thing. In the Middle Ages, no one was beyond the reach of wanted. And this brings us to a darker truth. Not all most wanted figures were rebels or rulers. Some were demons in human form, men and women whose crimes were so grotesque that even hardened chroniclers struggled to describe them. In the next part, we'll enter the world of killers, conspirators, and nobles who turned their castles into chambers of horror. From blood countesses to child murderers, this is the side of history that chills the bone. If medieval kings and queens could fall from thrones into the ranks of the wanted, then the next figures take us to an even darker frontier. People so twisted in their cruelty that their names still cling to us like shadows centuries later. These were not outlaws stealing bread or rebels defying taxes. These were predators in velvet and silk, nobles who turned privilege into weapons and left trails of horror behind them. Take Elizabeth Bathory, the infamous Blood Countess of Hungary. Born into wealth and power in 1560, she had everything: castles, lands, influence. But the rumors that grew around her were something else entirely. Whispers spread that young girls brought into her household as servants or companions were never seen again. Some claimed she tortured them, others that she bathed in their blood to preserve her beauty. Picture a towering fortress in the Carpathians, candlelight flickering against cold stone, and terrified peasants whispering about screams in the night. Was it true? Or was it, at least in part, political slander aimed at removing a powerful widow? Historians still argue. What we know is that in 1610, royal investigators stormed her castle and reported finding mutilated bodies. Witnesses spoke of dozens. Some even said hundreds of victims. The number, whether dozens or 600, hardly matters. The horror stuck. Elizabeth was never executed. Her rank protected her from public trial, but she was bricked into a chamber of her own castle, walled up with only a small opening for food and air. She died there in 1614, remembered not as a duchess but as a monster. For centuries, she has lived in legend as the noblewoman who turned youth into a commodity, a kind of vampire queen whose story rivaled Dracula himself. And speaking of Dracula, we cannot ignore Vlad the Impaler, already mentioned earlier. If Elizabeth was accused of bathing in blood, Vlad practically decorated his lands with it. Forests of impaled bodies lined the roadsides. Entire armies fled at the sight of his gruesome handiwork. He was a ruler and defender to some, a sadistic butcher to others, but either way, he was most wanted in every sense. It is no accident that Bram Stoker borrowed his name for a monster that still haunts our imagination. Yet Elizabeth and Vlad weren't alone. Across France, another noble earned infamy of the darkest kind. Gilles de Rais, once a celebrated knight and companion of Joan of Arc, he fought bravely in the 100 Years' War. For a time, he was the golden boy of France, rich, decorated, honored. But when the wars ended, the stories turned sinister. Behind the walls of his grand estates, children disappeared. Accusations swirled of kidnappings, grotesque rituals, and unspeakable murders. Some chroniclers claimed he sacrificed them in search of alchemical secrets. Others said it was sheer depravity. By 1440, the evidence, whether exaggerated or not, was so damning that he was arrested, tried, and executed by hanging and burning. Here lies the chilling truth. Gilles de Rais shows how quickly a hero could become a monster. One year, he rode beside Joan of Arc in the name of God. The next, he stood condemned as one of the darkest figures in French history. A saint and a butcher linked forever by a tragic turn. Then there were the heretics, those whose crime was not blood, but belief. Marguerite Porete, a French mystic, wrote, "The Mirror of Simple Souls," a book so bold, it argued that true union with God needed no church, no priests, no rituals. For that defiance, she was tried for heresy and burned at the stake in 1310. She had not led armies or committed murder, but in the eyes of medieval authorities, her pen was just as dangerous. To challenge the Church's monopoly on truth was to put yourself on the most wanted list of all, the Inquisitions. What unites these figures is how their notoriety outlived their bodies. Some were guilty, others likely victims of rumor and politics, but all became legends of terror. Their names were spoken like curses, their stories retold in whispers around firelight. They were proof that in the Middle Ages, wanted could mean more than law-breaking. It could mean fear itself, but not all horror came from nobles. Sometimes, the most hunted figures were ordinary men and women whose desperation collided with unjust laws. A starving peasant who snared a rabbit in the king's forest could be punished as severely as any murderer. To the lords, poachers were criminals. To the peasants, they were heroes, outlaws who turned hunger into resistance. In the next part, we'll step into those forests where survival itself was outlawed. We'll see how the simplest act, snaring a hare, gathering fallen wood, even fishing without permission, could turn an ordinary farmer into one of the most wanted of medieval society. Tonight we move away from bloodthirsty nobles and Gothic castles and step into the muddy boots of ordinary people. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't have to be a warlord or a heretic to land on the most wanted list. Sometimes all it took was a rabbit. Picture this. You're a peasant in 11th century England. You work sunup to sundown plowing your lord's fields. Your children are thin, your wife is tired, and the winter stores are running low. Then, one evening, you see a hare dart across the edge of the royal forest. That rabbit could mean soup, survival, life for your family, but if you catch it, you're a criminal. If you snare it, you risk prison, mutilation, or death. How insane is that? A creature small enough to fit in your hands was the difference between life and execution. Royal hunting laws were some of the harshest codes in medieval Europe. Forests were not just woods or meadows. They were political statements, stamped with the king's authority. William the Conqueror, in particular, enforced forest law with iron teeth. Entire villages were uprooted to create his New Forest in southern England, a preserve where only the king could hunt. Imagine being forced out of your home so that a monarch could chase deer with hounds. And if you dared sneak back to gather firewood or set a snare, you could lose your hand, your eyes, or your life. This wasn't about game meat. It was about dominance. Deer, boar, even rabbits were labeled the king's property. Killing one without permission was not theft. It was treason. Lords and clergy feasted on venison while peasants looked on hungry, forbidden from touching the very animals trampling their fields. It was hierarchy carved into law, reinforced by blood. But hunger doesn't care about laws. Families still risked it. They snuck into forests at night with silent snares and whispered prayers. Some were caught and punished cruelly. Others slipped away, becoming local legends. Stories began to spread of clever poachers who outwitted greedy lords, of outlaws who fought back, of rebels who lived in the shadows. Out of this soil grew one of the most famous figures in folklore, Robin Hood. Now, whether Robin was a real man or not is still debated. What matters is what he represented. He was the dream of every starving peasant that someone was standing up to the rich, snatching the king's deer and giving meat back to the people. He was the outlaw hero, a wanted man who turned crime into justice. And that legend didn't spring from nowhere. It grew from centuries of resentment, from peasants hanged for snares, from families punished for soup. But the royal hunt was more than cruelty, it was theater. Kings didn't just hunt for meat, they hunted for spectacle. Hunts were parades of power. Hundreds of dogs, hawks perched on gloved hands, courtiers riding in fine livery. Trumpets blared, banners waved, and nobles cheered as the king pursued a stag through forests his subjects weren't even allowed to enter. The stag wasn't just an animal, it was a symbol of sovereignty, a stand-in for nature itself, bowing to royal authority. To peasants watching from the margins, the message was clear. You toil, you starve, you obey. We feast, we hunt, we rule. And yet, even under such oppression, resistance simmered. Poaching songs, outlaw ballads, whispered tales, these became cultural weapons, tiny rebellions carried in rhyme and story. So when we talk about the most wanted of medieval history, we can't just focus on rebels like William Wallace or rulers like Vlad. We have to remember the nameless farmer who risked everything for a rabbit. In their own way, they were outlaws too, criminals branded not by greed or ambition, but by the human need to survive. In the next part, we'll step even deeper into the forest, into the royal hunt itself, not from the eyes of peasants, but from the saddle of kings. Because if stealing a rabbit could make you a wanted man, imagine what hunting a stag could make you a symbol of divinely ordained power. We've talked about poachers sneaking through the woods at night, risking death for a rabbit. But now, let's shift our view to the other side, the monarch on horseback, surrounded by banners, horns, and hounds. Because in the Middle Ages, the royal hunt wasn't just recreation. It was politics on four legs, theater played out in mud and blood. Imagine the scene at dawn. The forest is hushed, mist curling low through the trees. Then the sound of horns shatters the silence. Horses snort, dogs bark. Courtiers in embroidered livery gather around the king. Even in the mud, everything gleams. Polished tack on war horses, silken ribbons tied to falcons, the monarch draped in garments practical enough to ride, but splendid enough to remind everyone who's in charge. This wasn't simply about catching deer. It was a metaphor for kingship. Just as the stag was pursued through tangled woods, so too was justice pursued across the land, or at least, That's the image carefully cultivated. Chroniclers describe monarchs as tireless hunters whose control over beasts reflected their control over men. Killing a stag was spun as an act of divine order, a ritual victory over chaos. Religion was never far from the chase. Before hunts began, clergymen sometimes blessed the company, sprinkling holy water over horses and hounds. The stag itself carried Christian symbolism, often linked to Christ or the soul's pursuit of salvation. So when a king brought one down, it wasn't just sport, it was a faint echo of sacred triumph. In illuminated manuscripts, rulers are painted not as weary riders, but as serene figures, calmly orchestrating the chaos of horns and hounds with a raised hand. But the spectacle didn't stop at symbolism. The hunt was also a living court, a parliament without walls. Ambitious nobles vied to ride close to the king. A misplaced hound, a stolen strike, even a stumble in etiquette could turn into political disaster. On the other hand, staying close, keeping pace, or being invited to share the final kill could secure influence more effectively than a dozen formal councils. Imagine whispering a request for land or marriage while galloping beside the monarch through the woods. Those moments could shape careers. The climax of the hunt was charged with ceremony. When the quarry was finally exhausted, the honor of delivering the killing blow usually belonged to the king himself, or a favored noble chosen as a sign of favor. Heralds trumpeted, huntsmen knelt, and the final strike became a miniature coronation, a ritualized display of dominion. Sometimes the blood of the slain stag was smeared on squires' foreheads as a grim initiation, binding youth into the cycle of violence and loyalty. And then came the feast. Venison wasn't just meat, it was privilege. By law and custom, deer flesh was reserved for nobility. Peasants might gnaw on pork or mutton, but the crimson meat of the stag was forbidden to them, just like the forests themselves. At banquets, the venison was carved ceremonially, with choicest cuts going to the king, lesser portions to nobles, and scraps thrown to the hounds that had helped secure the kill. It was a hierarchy in miniature, a symbolic replay of feudal order written in meat and bone. The evening feast stretched into theater of its own. Courtiers toasted the monarch's courage. Poets compared him to Alexander or Caesar. Musicians filled the hall with triumphant fanfare. Every goblet raised, every roast carved, was another reminder that rulership was not just about law, but about spectacle. For foreign envoys, being invited to witness or join a hunt was both privilege and intimidation. To see a king command hundreds of hounds or a falcon strike prey with surgical precision was to understand his authority extended over nature itself. It was diplomacy played out in forests rather than throne rooms. But here's the irony. While nobles celebrated hunts as pageantry of power, peasants saw them as cages of injustice. For them, the royal horn echoing across the trees meant nothing but danger. Stricter laws, harsher penalties, and game they could never touch. In many ways, the royal hunt embodied the medieval divide, the ruler riding high, the subject standing hungry at the edge of the forest. So yes, a stag might be just an animal, but in the Middle Ages, it was also a crown, a cross, and a cage, all bound into one. And the man who killed it wasn't just a hunter. He was a king declaring to the world, "This land is mine, this beast is mine, and by extension so are you." In the next part, we'll stay in the forest, but turn our gaze to the animals themselves, the hounds, the hawks, the boars that turned the hunt into something between a battle and a ritual. Because in the medieval imagination, even the animals carried ranks, roles, and symbols in this deadly theater of power. Last time, we rode alongside kings, chasing stags through the misty woods. But a medieval hunt wasn't just about men in saddles. It was also about the animals, the hounds that thundered ahead, the falcons wheeling overhead, and the wild beasts that turned every chase into a dangerous gamble. In this theater of blood and pageantry, even creatures had ranks, roles, and meaning. Let's start with the hounds. No noble household was complete without a kennel full of specialized dogs, each bred for a particular task. Greyhounds, sleek and lightning fast, sprinted across open fields to chase down hares. Mastiffs, massive and powerful, stood ready for the terrifying job of facing down wild boar. Scent hounds, ancestors of modern bloodhounds, could follow the faintest trail through tangled undergrowth. To command a pack of such beasts was to command prestige. It wasn't just about catching game. It was proof that a lord had the wealth, the patience, and the authority to master nature itself. Then there were the hawks. Falconry wasn't just a pastime. It was practically a religion for the aristocracy. A single hawk could take years to train, and nobles took immense pride in teaching these birds to strike pheasants, partridges, or rabbits with uncanny precision. The sight of a falcon launched from a king's gloved hand, soaring, circling, and then plunging to snatch prey from the earth, was a visual metaphor for rulership. Swift, decisive, and absolute. And make no mistake, this wasn't for everyone. Medieval law had strict rules about which ranks could fly which birds. Only emperors could keep the rare and prized gerfalcon, while lesser nobles were limited to smaller species. To own a hawk beyond your station was an insult to the entire feudal order, a feathered rebellion against hierarchy. Imagine risking disgrace, or worse, simply because your bird was too magnificent. That's how deeply status ran. But while hounds and hawks embodied order, the prey often symbolized chaos, and nothing tested courage like the wild boar. Bristling with tusks, heavy with muscle, a charging boar could tear through horses, crush hounds, or kill a man outright. Hunting them wasn't just dangerous, it was almost suicidal. That was the point. To face a beast that could kill you back was to prove your worth as a warrior and a ruler. Special boar spears were made with crossbars beneath the blade to stop the animal from rushing further up the shaft once impaled. Even then, hunters often found themselves dragged to the ground in a frenzy of hooves and snapping tusks. Many nobles were maimed or killed in boar hunts. But to survive and strike the final blow earned admiration, even awe. It said, "Here is a man worthy of command." Stags, too, carried heavy symbolism. Known as the king of the forest, they were elusive, powerful, and often linked to Christ in Christian allegory. Bringing one down wasn't just a kill, it was a sacred act, celebrated with rituals and honored with antlers displayed like trophies of rulership. And then there were wolves, bears, even imported beasts. Wolves were relentless enemies of livestock, hunted to near extinction in many regions. Bears were baited for sport or pursued in dangerous chases. Some monarchs, eager to show off their reach, imported lions or leopards from abroad, and staged hunts that looked more like gladiatorial contests. Nothing declared global dominion like a king loosing hounds on a beast from another continent. For rulers, triumphing over these animals wasn't about meat, it was about message. Every chase, every kill shouted, "The king is master over life and death, over nature and men alike." When the blood spilled into the soil, it sanctified not only the hunt, but the idea of monarchy itself. So the next time you imagine a medieval hunt, don't just think of nobles on horseback. Think of the dogs panting at their feet, the hawks circling above, the boar charging through mud, the stag crowned with antlers, fleeing for its life. This was a moving stage, where every creature, hound, hawk, or beast, played a role in the grand performance of power. And yet, the story doesn't end with the kill. Because once the quarry was down, the real show began: the ritual butchering, the feast, the politics hidden in every slice of venison. In the next part, we'll walk straight into the medieval banquet hall and see how the hunt transformed from blood in the forest to bread, wine, and spectacle at the table. Last time we talked about the hounds, the hawks, and the wild beasts that turned every royal hunt into a theater of danger and mastery. But the hunt didn't end when the animal fell. In fact, the kill was only the prologue. The real story unfolded when the carcass was carried back to the castle and transformed into ritual, feast, and politics. Picture the scene: the trumpets still echoing from the woods, horses sweating from the chase, and servants hauling the stag or boar back to the courtyard. The body wasn't treated like common game. It was elevated, laid out ceremoniously, and cut apart according to strict tradition. This ritual butchering, called the cure, was a performance in itself. Every cut, every portion mattered. The choicest parts, like the haunches, were reserved for the king or high nobles. The hounds were rewarded with entrails, tossed ceremoniously as the crowd watched. Even the dogs were actors in the pageantry. For commoners who managed to glimpse these ceremonies, the message was unmistakable. Their ruler not only ruled men but also nature, and the bounty of the forest flowed directly through him. The stag's blood wasn't just blood, it was a royal proclamation carved into flesh. Then came the banquet. If the hunt was the king's battlefield, the table was his throne. Venison roasted over open flames filled the halls with smoke and savory sweetness. Wine flowed in rivers, and great loaves of bread soaked up the juices. The meal was no simple dinner, it was theater staged on wooden tables, with gold and silver goblets reflecting torchlight across the vaulted ceiling, and every bite carried politics. To be seated near the king was a privilege beyond price. To be served first was recognition of favor. Even the dish placed before a noble could signal his standing. Did he receive the stag's shoulder, rich with meat, or some lesser cut? Medieval banquets were choreographed like ballets, with food as symbols of loyalty, rank, and power. The clergy were never far from these feasts. A prayer before the meal reminded everyone that the hunt, however bloody, was blessed by God. The stag itself could be described in sermons as Christ-like, swift, noble, hunted, but ultimately sacrificed for the good of the people. For nobles, this was reassurance that their violence had divine meaning. For peasants, peering through open doors, or hearing the echoes of horns from afar, it reinforced that their king's rule was not only strong, but sacred. And let's not forget the entertainment. Minstrels and jesters sang ballads of great hunts, sometimes improvising verses that flattered their lord. Dancers spun across the rush-strewn floors, while jugglers and acrobats distracted from the greasy bones piling up. Laughter, song, and clinking cups mixed with the aroma of venison and boar. The hunt had become legend before the meat was even cold. What's fascinating is how much these feasts blurred the line between survival and spectacle. Yes, food was eaten, but more importantly, hierarchy was displayed, order was confirmed, and the king's authority was carved into memory as surely as into venison. Even foreign envoys invited to these tables would leave with no doubt. Here was a ruler both generous and terrifying, capable of feeding his people and commanding nature itself. Over time, these banquets grew more elaborate. In some courts, the presentation of the roasted stag was as dramatic as a coronation. Dressed in embroidery, adorned with flags, even restitched into lifelike poses, the carcass entered the hall like a holy relic. Imagine servants carrying a stag upright on a platform, antlers crowned with flowers, while trumpets blared. Was this food or theater? The answer was both. For peasants excluded from the table, scraps might be distributed as acts of charity. Even this was calculated. A piece of meat tossed to the poor wasn't just kindness. It was a reminder of dependency, a visible sign that survival trickled down from the king's forest to their bowl. So, the hunt's true climax wasn't the moment the stag fell in the forest. It was here, in the hall, where venison turned into symbols, where politics, religion, and power were eaten and digested along with the meat. The feast was monarchy, embodied, bloody, abundant, awe-inspiring, and inescapable. But while kings dined, others lived very different stories. For every stag killed in splendor, there were poachers lurking in the shadows, risking everything for a slice of the same meat. And their story of hunger, defiance, and rebellion was just as much a part of the medieval forest as the royal horn. While kings and nobles raised golden goblets over venison, outside the castle walls a different story simmered. For the common folk, the royal forest was less a playground than a prison. Imagine watching herds of deer wander through fields that you had plowed with blistered hands, knowing you could not touch them. Every antler, every tusk, every feather belonged not to nature, but to the crown. And the penalty for forgetting that could be savage. Under William the Conqueror and the kings who followed, forest law became one of the harshest systems of control in medieval Europe. To poach a deer or a boar was not just theft, it was treason against the king himself. Punishments were designed to terrify. Crippling fines that ruined families, mutilations like the loss of an eye or a hand, and in some cases, execution, all for the sake of protecting royal privilege. Think about that for a moment. A man might steal bread and be whipped, but if he dared to take a rabbit from the king's land to feed his starving children, he could be blinded. The message was clear. Hunger was no excuse when the prey was marked by royal decree. The forest was sacred not to God, but to the throne. No wonder resentment boiled beneath the surface. Peasants sang ballads of outlaws who defied the law, striking back at the lords who kept meat from their tables. The most famous of these legends, of course, was Robin Hood. Though wrapped in myth, his story spoke to a very real truth. The poor dreamed of justice in the forest, of a hero who could snatch venison from the king's table and place it in their own pot. Gamekeepers, verderers, and foresters became hated figures in the villages. They patrolled like armed wardens, seizing traps, punishing children, enforcing rules that seemed less about order and more about humiliation. To the peasantry, they were not protectors of nature but extensions of tyranny. And yet, without them, the king's monopoly on the hunt would collapse. Every hound unleashed, every arrow loosed in secret was an act of rebellion. The irony is striking. While kings staged hunts to prove their might, the poor waged their own silent hunts at night, furtive, hungry, desperate. To kill a deer illegally was more than filling a stomach. It was resistance, a statement whispered in the dark woods. We belong here too. These tensions turned the forest into a battleground of class. Nobles galloped under banners, horns blaring, while peasants crept with snares and silence. One side hunted for glory, the other for survival. And between them stood laws sharper than any antler, designed to remind everyone of their place in the order of things. It wasn't just about food. Gathering firewood, letting pigs forage for acorns, even walking the wrong path through the royal preserve could be grounds for punishment. For peasants, daily life was a negotiation with fear, the forest both sustainer and trap. They could hear the horns of the royal hunt echoing across the fields while their children went hungry at home. This clash between privilege and poverty gave birth to stories, some bitter, some hopeful. Tales of outlaw bands, tricksters, and brave men who outwitted sheriffs spread from village to village, reminding people that even in a world of rigid hierarchy, resistance was possible. Whether Robin Hood ever lived or not, his legend thrived because it gave voice to a truth peasants lived every day. The hunt was not just sport, it was oppression. So, while the king feasted on venison in gilded halls, in the cottages nearby men whispered songs of rebellion, women stirred thin soups, and children dreamed of forests where food was free, and justice wasn't chained by the antlers of royal law. To call a royal hunt just sport would be to miss its entire meaning. For medieval monarchs, every detail was deliberate theater. Horses were brushed until their coats gleamed like polished bronze. Tack was burnished until it reflected sunlight, and the huntsmen wore livery sewn in the king's colors, banners fluttering above them as if the forest itself bowed to royal authority. The king was never simply a rider in mud-stained boots. His garments struck a careful balance between function and spectacle, rich enough to display majesty, but practical enough to let him ride hard. Even in the deep woods, surrounded by hounds and horns, he was on stage. The chase itself mirrored kingship. Just as he pursued a stag through tangled thickets, so too did he pursue order, justice, and dominion across his realm. Chroniclers adored this symbolism. They painted him in their manuscripts not as a weary hunter but as a serene figure, calm hand raised, horn at his lips, orchestrating chaos into harmony. Every step of the hunt was marked with ritual. Trumpets blared at the start, horns signaled each phase, and when the quarry fell, the mort, a solemn horn call, echoed through the trees, honoring the animal as though it were a knight slain in battle. A stag was not just meat. It was a symbol of Christ, of endurance, of kingship itself. To bring it down was not only a demonstration of courage, but of divine favor. Religion was woven into the hunt's very fabric. Priests often rode alongside, blessing the hunters before they set out, murmuring prayers for safety, even sprinkling holy water on the hounds. To the peasants who glimpsed these processions from afar, the image was unmistakable. Their king was not just a ruler of men, but chosen by heaven, master of the wild as well as the throne. Imagine the sight banners snapping in the wind, horns calling across the valleys, hounds surging forward like a living tide. To hear that sound was to know the king was present, strong, ordained. Even if you were a farmer bent over your fields, the echo of horns was a proclamation. The monarch commands not just castles and courts, but the very heartbeat of the land. Over time, these hunts became inseparable from kingship itself. By the late Middle Ages, one could hardly picture a king without his hounds or hawks, without a forest claimed for his exclusive use. And yet, history is never static. Towns grew, armies professionalized, and the grip of forest law slowly loosened. What began as a brutal monopoly softened into grand tradition. Still, the echoes remained. Even centuries later, rulers like Henry VIII in England or the French monarchs of the Renaissance staged hunts as elaborate as coronations. The imagery persisted in heraldry and coats of arms: the stag for nobility, the boar for courage, the falcon for authority. These symbols outlived the hunts themselves, etched into culture, law, and imagination. Think about it. Even today, when we see fox hunts in England or stag hunts in Central Europe, we are glimpsing shadows of this medieval spectacle. It's not just about chasing animals. It's about echoing a language of power that once defined who ruled and who obeyed. The hunt, in the end, was never only about venison. It was theater. It was faith. It was politics on horseback. Every gallop, every horn blast, every ritual cut of meat spoke a single truth. The king hunts, the king feasts, the king rules. Hey guys, so far we've seen kings prove their power through hunts and pageantry, turning forests into theaters of dominance. But now let's shift scenes, away from the woods and into a glittering palace in Persia, where another kind of spectacle unfolded. This time, it wasn't the chase of a stag or the slaying of a boar. It was a wedding, one of the strangest, boldest, and most controversial weddings in history. Spring, 324 BC. The city of Susa, a jewel of the Persian Empire, turned into the stage for Alexander the Great's grand experiment. By then, Alexander wasn't content with just conquering half the known world. He wanted to merge it, east and west, Macedon and Persia, not just living side by side, but tied together by blood, family, and children. And to make that vision real, he didn't just marry a Persian princess himself. He ordered nearly 80 of his top generals to do the same. Picture the palace: golden couches, silver tables groaning under endless food, silk draperies glowing in the torchlight, the scent of incense and wine filling the air. At the very center sat Alexander, radiant like a living god, and beside him his bride Statira, daughter of the fallen Persian king Darius III. By marrying her, Alexander wasn't just gaining a wife. He was making a statement. He was no longer a mere conqueror of Persia. He was its rightful heir. For the Persians, this was a triumph. Their daughters weren't captives of war. They were queens, elevated to the side of the most powerful warriors on earth. Their families, once fearing ruin, suddenly found themselves bound to the new regime. Alexander wasn't erasing Persia. He was weaving it into his empire. But for his Macedonian soldiers, the picture was very different. These were tough men who had marched for years through deserts and mountains, who had toppled Persia with their spears and their blood. Many of them already had wives waiting back home. And now they were ordered into silk-robed weddings with women whose fathers they had fought against. In the candlelight of Susa's palace, with music playing and golden cups raised, many generals smiled only because they had no choice. Behind those smiles burned resentment. The banquet itself was dazzling. Ancient sources describe fountains flowing with wine, musicians playing lutes and flutes, dancers moving through clouds of incense. Every bride was given a dowry, every groom a reward, and even the rank-and-file soldiers got gifts from Alexander's treasury. He wanted no one to leave empty-handed, even his hounds. The dogs that had followed the army across Asia were fed meat from golden platters. It was generosity on a scale meant to impress, to dazzle, and to silence dissent. But resentment doesn't vanish under candlelight. Many veterans whispered that Alexander was going Persian. They saw their king dressed in silk robes, wearing a Persian crown, sitting proudly beside Darius's daughter, and it frightened them. Was the man they followed still their Macedonian king, or had he become something else? For Alexander, this wasn't betrayal. It was the whole point. He wanted his men tied to Persia, not just by treaties or garrisons, but by family, by children who would be both Macedonian and Persian. He dreamed of a new ruling class, one that could erase old divisions and unite his empire for generations to come. But history is cruel to dreamers. Barely a year later, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, and almost instantly, the marriages unraveled. His generals cast aside their Persian wives, returning to their old families or seeking new alliances as they carved the empire into pieces. For the Persian women who had stepped into the spotlight of power, it was betrayal. Many were abandoned with children left stranded between two worlds, children of a dream that died with Alexander. The Susa weddings should have been the start of something grand. Instead, they became a symbol of Alexander's ambition and his hubris. He could conquer nations. He could command loyalty on the battlefield, but he could not force people to change their hearts. For one night in Susa, under golden lamps and music that echoed through marble halls, Macedonians and Persians dined together as kin. But by morning, the cracks were already showing, and in the end, that night went down in history not as the birth of a united empire, but as proof that even the greatest conqueror couldn't command love with the same ease he commanded an army. Last time we left off at the glittering halls of Susa, where Alexander the Great forced a grand vision of unity onto his army. 80 marriages in one night, with gold, silk, and wine flowing like rivers. But dreams don't always last, and Alexander's dream unraveled almost as soon as he was gone. In 323 BC, only a year after that spectacle, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon at the age of 32. No one could believe it. The man who had crossed deserts, toppled kings, and marched all the way to India was gone in an instant. His body wasn't even cold before the empire began to split. And with his death, the Susa marriages collapsed like a palace built on sand. Many of the generals who had accepted Persian brides abandoned them immediately. Some slipped quietly back to their Macedonian wives. Others sought new alliances as the scramble for power began. For the Persian women, it was devastating. Just months earlier, they were symbols of unity, honored as queens and noble brides. Now, they were cast aside, their children left in limbo, half Macedonian, half Persian, but belonging nowhere. The wars that followed became known as the Wars of the Diadochi. The successors, Alexander had built an empire that stretched farther than anyone before him, but he left no clear heir old enough to rule. His generals, men who had once stood beside him at Susa's banquet table, turned on each other in brutal struggles. They carved up the empire into pieces, kingdoms that often looked more like rival war camps than a united realm. The Susa marriages, meant to bind these men together, became nothing more than an awkward footnote. The ties of blood that Alexander envisioned could not withstand ambition, greed, and mistrust. The children of those unions faded into obscurity, while their fathers fought for crowns and cities. And yet, Alexander's dream wasn't entirely lost. Though the marriages dissolved, the idea of fusion lingered. Greek and Persian cultures continued to influence each other in art, clothing, and ceremony. Coins bore designs that blended traditions. Soldiers adopted foreign customs. Even centuries later, historians would debate whether Alexander was truly ahead of his time or simply blinded by his own arrogance. Think about it. Could any man, even one as great as Alexander, really change the hearts of warriors who had grown up seeing Persians as enemies? Could he erase centuries of rivalry with a single night of feasting? Probably not. But what he tried to do still echoes. The Susa weddings remind us that conquest might be won with swords, but unity that requires something deeper. So, in the end, Alexander's experiment was both brilliant and tragic. Brilliant because he saw a possibility that few others dared to imagine. Tragic because his death revealed just how fragile it all was. The empire split, the marriages crumbled, and the women of Persia, once celebrated, were left with broken promises. One night of golden dreams, followed by centuries of bloody reality. We've seen how empires can rise and fall on the vision of one man. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just kings and conquerors who shaped history. Sometimes, the most dangerous figures were not crowned rulers at all. They were mystics, rebels, or even peasants who simply refused to obey. Take Marguerite Porete, for example. In a time when questioning the church was about as safe as juggling torches soaked in oil, she decided the official teachings weren't good enough. Born in France in the late 13th century, Marguerite was a mystic with a vision of God that bypassed the entire church hierarchy. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, argued that true spirituality didn't require priests, bishops, or rituals. You could reach God directly, soul to soul. That idea was as radical as telling the IRS that taxes were optional. At first, her book quietly circulated. Some loved it, but word spread upward, and eventually, the Inquisition took notice. They expected her to fold, to weep, to recant. But Marguerite didn't budge. She stood by her words even when she was dragged before judges in Paris. The verdict was inevitable: guilty of heresy. The punishment? Death by fire. In 1310, she was burned at the stake before a crowd that gathered as though it were a theater performance. Public executions were not private justice. They were medieval reality TV. But here's the twist. Her book survived. Despite being banned, It was copied in secret and later recognized as one of the most beautiful works of Christian mysticism. The church killed Marguerite, but they couldn't kill her ideas. She wasn't swinging a sword, leading armies, or plotting assassinations. Her crime was something far more dangerous in the medieval world, thinking freely and refusing to apologize for it. But the most wanted list wasn't just about mystics. It was also filled with rebels who knew how to turn new weapons into old-fashioned chaos. Picture the early 15th century, when gunpowder had just made its way into Europe. Cannons, bombs, barrels of powder. Suddenly, peasants and rebels had a way to strike at castles without needing a knight's training. The Hussites of Bohemia, for example, looked at the corruption of the church and decided they'd had enough. These weren't just protesters with placards. They were peasants hurling primitive grenades, rolling wagons bristling with cannons, and even strapping gunpowder to barrels to blow apart enemy lines. Sometimes their experiments exploded too early, killing their own men. But when they worked, the effect was terrifying. Still, sneaking a giant barrel of powder into a castle wasn't exactly subtle. Imagine trying to walk past guards while leaving a trail of black dust on the ground. Most of these attempts failed, and when they did, the punishment was brutal: hangings, quarterings, even burning rebels alive next to the very barrels they had hoped to ignite. Yet people kept trying. The idea of blowing up tyranny was too tempting to abandon. By the time Guy Fawkes plotted his infamous gunpowder treason in 1605, the concept wasn't new. It was just bigger, bolder, and destined to fail just as spectacularly. But not all most wanted figures were rebels or heretics. Some were warriors who became legends, feared by kings and adored by their people. One of the greatest was Saladin. Born in 1137 inches Tikrit. To the Crusaders, he was the ultimate nightmare. Brilliant, disciplined, and unstoppable. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, he crushed the Crusader army and captured Jerusalem, turning the entire crusading dream upside down. Popes raged, kings swore vengeance, and armies were raised to stop him, and yet even his enemies respected him. Unlike most medieval warlords, Saladin didn't massacre the people of Jerusalem. He ransomed them, spared lives, and behaved with a courtesy that baffled Europe. Even Richard the Lionheart, his fiercest opponent, shared a strange respect for him. They fought bitterly, but Saladin once sent medicine to Richard when he was sick. Think about that, your sworn enemy, caring enough to send a remedy. Saladin was wanted, yes, but he was also admired. He proved that you could terrify your enemies and still win their respect. That made him twice as dangerous. By now you can see a pattern. The medieval most wanted were not all cut from the same cloth. Some were ruthless killers, others visionaries, and a few like Saladin were simply too competent for their enemies to handle. But the strangest outlaw of them all? A man who fought not in mountains or castles, but in the swamps. And his name was Hereward the Wake. We've talked about mystics who burned for their words, and generals who rose and fell with gunpowder. But now, let's step into the marshes of 11th century England, where one man turned mud, reeds, and stubborn defiance into weapons that frustrated the most powerful king in Europe. His name was Hereward the Wake, and to the Normans, he was a ghost that refused to die. Born around 1035, Hereward came from an Anglo-Saxon noble family. When William the Conqueror invaded in 1066 and started carving up England like a prize banquet, most nobles bent the knee. Hereward did not. Instead, he became an outlaw, raiding Norman garrisons, ambushing patrols, and slipping away into the swamps. His legend grew at Ely, a marshy island fortress in the fens. Picture it: a band of farmers, exiled nobles, and drunks with pitchforks, standing ankle-deep in bog water, shouting insults at armored knights who couldn't even charge without sinking. The Normans were furious. The locals adored him. Hereward wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol that even after conquest, England's spirit wasn't entirely broken. Stories about him quickly turned into medieval comic books. Some said he disguised himself as a potter to sneak into Norman camps. Others claimed he fought a bear with his bare hands. Were those true? Probably not. But in the Middle Ages, truth mattered less than making sure your hero sounded unstoppable. William the Conqueror threw everything at Ely: bribes, siege engines, whole armies. But Hereward slipped away, again and again. Eventually, the rebellion collapsed under betrayal and Norman strength. As for Hereward himself, the record fades into mystery. Some claim he made peace and lived quietly. Others insist he was killed. The most entertaining version? That he vanished back into the swamp, laughing behind a curtain of reeds. To the Normans, he was a criminal. To the Saxons, a folk hero. To historians, a headache, because separating fact from legend is nearly impossible. But one thing is certain: Hereward proved you didn't need castles or armies or even dry socks to become most wanted. All you needed was grit, a swamp, and the nerve to make kings feel powerless. But not everyone on the most wanted list was a noble rebel. Sometimes it was just a starving farmer with a rabbit in his pocket. In the Middle Ages, poaching wasn't a small crime. It was treated as treason. Imagine breaking your back in the fields all day, then snaring a rabbit to feed your children only to be branded an outlaw. Forest law was merciless. Kill a deer? Lose a hand. Set traps in the royal forest? Face prison, or worse. Repeat offender? Execution. All for stew. And yet hunger is persuasive. Peasants risked everything for a handful of meat, creeping into the woods at night with snares and bows, hoping no gamekeeper would catch them. The punishment wasn't about protecting deer. It was about reminding peasants who owned the land, the animals, and their dignity. Meanwhile, nobles held massive hunts where dozens of deer were slaughtered for sport. Fairness? Nowhere on the medieval menu. Yet poachers became folk heroes. Ballads turned them into clever underdogs who outsmarted greedy lords. Out of those stories grew the ultimate outlaw legend, Robin Hood. Whether he truly lived or not, he became the fantasy of every hungry villager who dreamed of justice in a world that denied it. In reality, most caught poachers didn't get songs. They got the gallows. But their quiet defiance left a mark, proving that sometimes the most wanted people weren't kings or knights, but ordinary men who refused to starve quietly. So far, we've seen rebels, mystics, and outlaws, but hunting itself was more than crime or sport. For kings, it was politics in motion. Forests weren't just wilderness, they were symbols of power. A royal hunt wasn't a casual outing. It was a performance of authority. Trumpets, banners, hounds, and falcons turned each chase into theater. A king's pursuit of a stag symbolized his pursuit of order and dominion. To peasants watching from the pretend fields, the sound of horns echoing through the woods wasn't just noise, it was a royal proclamation. The king is here. The king is strong. The king commands. And if you were caught stealing even a stick of firewood from those forests, that was treated as defiance against the crown itself. Forest law made sure of it. The king's game was sacred. His hunt, untouchable. His power, unquestionable. But the irony? The same laws that crushed peasants also gave rise to the most enduring outlaw heroes. In a way, every royal hunt, every gallop of horses and pack of hounds, fueled the legend of the poacher who slipped away. Last time we ended with the poachers sneaking into forests for survival, chased by laws harsher than death itself. But here's the flip side. What happened when kings and nobles rode out into those same forests? Hunting wasn't just leisure for the elite. It was a moving court, a living display of hierarchy, and sometimes a deadly test of courage. Picture the scene. Dawn mist still clinging to the fields, horns echoing through the trees, hounds straining at their leashes, falcons perched on leather gloves. The king rode at the center, surrounded by nobles vying for a place at his side. The hunt wasn't only about chasing deer or boar. It was about showing the entire kingdom that nature, like men, bowed before the crown. The animals themselves carried meaning. Stags, called the king of the forest, symbolized nobility and even Christ himself. To bring one down wasn't just a kill, it was a ritual victory over chaos, a performance of divine order. Boar hunts were even riskier. A charging boar could rip open a horse or disembowel a man. That's why boar spears had crossbars, to keep the beast from climbing up the shaft after being stabbed. Hunting them wasn't just bravery, it was politics. A king who faltered earned whispers. A king who stood his ground earned respect. And then came the exotic hunts, staged for pure spectacle. Some monarchs imported lions, leopards, even bears to release in controlled hunts. Why? Because nothing said, "I rule the world," like slaying beasts from another continent. It was theater, plain and simple, a performance of dominance over both nature and empire. But the real climax wasn't always in the chase. It was in the banquet after the hunt. Venison, the crimson meat of the stag, was considered food of kings, forbidden to commoners. To serve it at a royal table was a signal. This table belongs to power. Lesser nobles received lesser cuts, and scraps went to the hounds. The division of meat was like a miniature version of feudal society, reminding everyone of their place. Feasts turned kills into propaganda. Poets recited verses comparing the king to Caesar. Musicians struck up triumphant fanfares. Courtiers toasted his courage. To be seated near the monarch at that table could make or break a career. To miss the hunt? That could mean being forgotten. For peasants, these hunts weren't pageants but punishments. Forest laws barred them from touching the game that destroyed their crops, while nobles slaughtered animals by the dozens for sport. Forest wardens enforced it ruthlessly, gouging eyes or chopping hands for poaching. And yet, defiance lingered in whispers and songs. Robin Hood and countless nameless poachers became folk heroes, precisely because the king's hunt symbolized the gap between privilege and survival. Even so, the hunt was too powerful a symbol to fade. Chroniclers described kings not just as rulers, but as tireless hunters, chasing justice the way they chased stags. Illuminated manuscripts painted serene monarchs calmly directing chaos with a raised horn. Religion wrapped itself into the ritual too. Priests blessed the hunts, and some even compared the pursuit of the stag to the pursuit of salvation. By the late Middle Ages, hunting became less about raw power and more about tradition. Towns expanded, armies demanded attention, and laws softened a little, but the symbolism endured. The stag still appeared on coats of arms. The falcon remained a metaphor for authority. And the idea of a king as hunter, master of beasts, men, and destiny stayed etched into Europe's imagination. From the swamps of Hereward the Wake to the banquets of kings, one thing becomes clear. In the medieval world, to be most wanted wasn't just about crimes or rebellions. Sometimes it was about survival. Sometimes it was about pageantry. But always it was about power, who had it, who defied it, and who got crushed beneath it. So far, we've seen medieval rulers proving their dominance with hunts, feasts, and rituals of blood and pageantry. But kings weren't the only ones who understood the power of spectacle. Let's jump back in time to one of history's greatest showmen, Alexander the Great. His empire stretched from Greece to India, and he didn't just conquer with armies. He conquered with theater. One of his boldest stunts was staged in 324 BCE in the Persian city of Susa. Imagine a palace dripping with gold and silk, transformed into the scene of a wedding unlike anything the world had ever seen. Alexander married Statira, daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius III, while forcing around 80 of his generals to marry Persian noblewomen at the same time. That wasn't love, it was strategy. To Persians, it was an honor. Their daughters were bound to the most powerful men alive, and their bloodlines tied to the new rulers. To Macedonian soldiers, though, it was humiliation. These were men who had spent years bleeding to defeat Persia. Now they were ordered to embrace its nobility as family. Many already had wives waiting back home in Greece. What were they supposed to do now? Keep two households, one Greek and one Persian. The banquet was dazzling. Golden cups, silver tables, music, dancers, incense rising in curls. Alexander presided like a living god, flanked by his new brides and his generals lined up with theirs. He even gave out gifts, lavish dowries, rewards, even handouts to common soldiers. On the surface, it looked like unity, East and West bound together in harmony. But beneath the laughter, Macedonian resentment simmered. Soldiers whispered that their king was turning Persian, draping himself in silks, marrying enemy princesses, and erasing the rough traditions of Macedon. For Persians, the symbolism was clear. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was claiming to be the rightful heir of Persia's throne. By marrying into the dynasty of Darius, he declared himself not just ruler by conquest, but ruler by blood. To them, it was continuity. To Macedonians, it felt like betrayal. And yet, Alexander pressed on. He wasn't trying to be a Greek king anymore. He was trying to be something new, a universal monarch. He encouraged his men to adopt Persian customs, promoted Persians into his army and government, and even trained Persian youths in Macedonian military discipline. His vision wasn't just to conquer lands, but to fuse cultures. The trouble was, vision alone couldn't erase centuries of hatred. When Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, the marriages of Susa unraveled almost overnight. Generals abandoned their Persian wives. children of those unions were left in limbo. Instead of unity, the empire split into rival kingdoms as his successors tore each other apart in the wars of the Diadochi. Still, the image of Susa lingered in history. One glittering night, when East and West sat at one table, when the conqueror staged not just a marriage, but a metaphor for empire itself. It was both brilliant and naive, a dream of unity that collapsed the moment its dreamer was gone. And Alexander knew the importance of spectacle didn't stop with weddings. Between his campaigns, when soldiers weren't marching or fighting, he turned his army camps into festivals, complete with athletic games, sacrifices, theater, and feasts that kept his men loyal and proud. These weren't distractions. They were strategy. Imagine thousands of hardened warriors, scarred from battle, suddenly watching wrestling matches, foot races, or spear-throwing contests in a dusty camp. Victors were crowned with olive wreaths, cheered by comrades who had fought beside them in phalanx formations. It wasn't just fun, it was training, disguised as celebration. No festival began without sacrifice. Priests slaughtered bulls or rams, offering blood to Zeus, Heracles, and the gods. Smoke and prayers carried through the air, reminding the soldiers that their cause wasn't just conquest, but destiny. Then came the feasts. Meat roasted on spits, wine flowed, and Alexander himself raised cups beside his men. He wasn't just their king, he was their comrade, drinking with them, laughing with them, reminding them that they were one family. Even theater followed them across Asia. Actors performed tragedies of Aeschylus or comedies of Aristophanes in makeshift wooden stages, giving soldiers a taste of home even as they camped in Persia or India. Music, laughter, poetry. They reminded the men that they weren't just mercenaries. They were Greeks, heirs of a culture that stretched back to Homer. Mock battles capped the displays, with cavalry charging in dazzling maneuvers and phalanxes drilling in formation. For foreign dignitaries watching, it was propaganda, living proof that Alexander's army never grew weak, never lost discipline. For the soldiers themselves, it was pride. Alexander knew exactly what he was doing. Festivals were loyalty made visible. They bound soldiers to each other, to their king, and to a vision of empire that felt larger than life. It was political genius joy disguised as control. And that's why, when historians look back, they don't just see the battles and conquests. They see the celebrations, the sacrifices, the golden banquets, and the laughter that kept an empire alive, if only for a moment. Hey guys, we've wandered through a long road together across the swamps of outlaw rebels, through the courts of tyrants, into the blood-soaked rituals of nobles, and even into Alexander's glittering palace halls. Along the way, we've met the most wanted people of the medieval and ancient world. Some were feared, some admired, some despised, and some celebrated centuries after they vanished. But all of them shared one thing: they disturbed the order of their time. That's what being most wanted really meant in history. It wasn't always about committing crimes in the way we think of them today. Sometimes it was about rebellion, sometimes about daring to write a book that questioned authority, sometimes about refusing to bow to the rules of kings or popes. Whether it was Vlad the Impaler terrifying empires with forests of corpses, or poachers risking their lives for a single rabbit, history's most wanted people stood out because they refused to accept the limits set upon them. And isn't that what makes their stories still echo today? Because when we strip away the crowns, the castles, the swords, and the rituals, we're left with human beings who lived on the edge of survival and power. They remind us how fragile authority really is. A king could be feared in the morning, yet mocked by nightfall if a swamp rebel made him look foolish. A countess could live in splendor, yet end up walled into her own castle like a prisoner. A hero of France could march beside Joan of Arc, and within a few years become a villain burned at the stake. History doesn't promise happy endings. What it does promise is that power will always be contested, order will always be fragile, and the stories of those who defied the rules, whether with violence, faith, or desperation, will always capture our imagination. Think back to Alexander's festivals. Thousands of men bound together not only by battle, but by song, feast, and laughter. Or think of the peasants who risked everything to snare a rabbit, because hunger was a stronger master than any king. In their own way, both reveal the same truth. Control is never absolute. People find ways to resist, to survive, and to remind rulers that their grip can slip at any moment. That's why these figures became legends. Not because they were perfect, but because they were unforgettable. Some terrified, some inspired, but all left scars and echoes that time could never erase. So what do we take away from this journey? Maybe that history's most wanted aren't just villains or heroes, they're warnings, they're questions. They force us to ask what we would do in their place. Would we resist, like Owain Glyndwr? Would we terrify our enemies like Vlad? Would we dare to think and write like Marguerite Porete? Or would we simply try to keep our families alive, even if it meant breaking the king's law for a piece of meat on the table? As we close this story, remember, history isn't only about kings and crowns. It's about the people who pushed back, who lived loudly enough to be remembered, and who, in their own ways, remind us of how complex, brutal, and strangely beautiful the human past has always been. Thank you guys for staying with me through this long journey into the shadows of the Middle Ages and beyond. If you found this story fascinating, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And now, I'll leave you with this thought. The past is never really gone. It lives on in the tales we tell, in the warnings we heed, and in the questions we continue to ask. Sleep well, dream deep, and let the echoes of history keep you company tonight. Good night.